I was looking at my phone recently. One headline immediately caught my attention. Artemis 2 crew returns safely after attempting mission around the moon. The moment I saw that, an old question come back to life. If humanity really went to the moon once more than half a century ago, why does the mission in our own time still feel so extraordinary? Why does their crude journey around the moon in the 2020s sound like the return of something almost forgotten? And perhaps most importantly, why do so many people still believe that the original moon landing was a hoax? That question has never truly disappeared. Even now, decades after, Apollo 11, arguments about the moon landing still show up online in documentaries and in comment sections everywhere. For many people, Apollo 11 was one of the greatest achievements in human history. For others, it remains one of the biggest lies ever told. So, to understand why the moon landing is still considered a hoax by some people, we have to go back not only to the mission itself, but also to the political, cultural, and emotional environment that gave birth to these doubts. In April 2026, Artemis 2 returned safely to Earth after carrying 4 astronauts on a crewed lunar flyby mission. It was their first crewed mission of the Artemis program and the first time human beings had traveled beyond low Earth orbit since, Apollo 17 in 1972. The mission didn't land on the moon, but it circled around it and come back as a test for future missions that are meant to return astronauts to the lunar surface. That alone was enough to make many people ask a very simple but a powerful question. If NASA could land human beings on the moon in 1969, why did it take more than 50 years to send astronauts back to lunar orbit? That question sounds reasonable, and for many people, it becomes the beginning of a suspicion. On July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 made history. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon while Michael Collins remained in lunar orbit aboard the command module. Armstrong became the first human to step onto the lunar surface, followed by the Aldrin. It was a moment broadcast to hundreds of millions of people around the world, and it has instantly become one of the most iconic events of the 20th century. But to some people, the success of their mission has always seemed almost too incredible. They look at the technology of the 1960s, comparing to what exists today, and wonder how such a feat could, have been achieved at all. Once that doubt enters their mind, every image, every shadow, every technical details begin to look suspicious. Much of the modern moon host movement can be traced back to Bill Casey, whose 1976 book "We Never Went to the Moon" helped popularize the idea that Apollo had been staged. Casey was not an engineer or an astronaut, but because he had worked as a technical writer for Rocketdyne and the company that built the Center Fire engines, some people treated him as an insider. His book argued that the odds of a successful moon landing were so low that NASA must have failed their mission instead. Over time, his claims spread through television, conspiracy books, and eventually the internet. But the reason those claims found such fertile ground has as much to do with their culture as with science. The 1970s were a time of deep mistrust in the United States. The Vietnam War had badly damaged the public confidence in government. Watergate showed that the highest levels of power could lie to the public. As that distrust grew, many people became more willing to believe that the official stories were carefully manufactured performances. In the atmosphere, the moon landing became more than just a technical, achievement. It became a symbol. If the government could lie about the war, some people reason, then perhaps it could lie about space as well. Their emotional logic was powerful. Conspiracy theories do not only survive because of evidence, they survive because they satisfy a feeling, and their feeling in that case was distrust. One of their most famous hoax claims concerns the American flag planted on the moon. In some footage and photographs, the flag appears rippled, and at certain moments it seems to move. To some skeptics, that is a live proof of a wind, and if there was a wind, then the footage must have been found on Earth. But the simple explanation is that the flag was attached to a horizontal rod, so it would not hang limp when the astronauts twisted their pole into the ground. The fabric moved because of the motion, and because there is no air on the moon, there was no atmospheric drag to stop the movement quickly. So the flag could swim briefly and then remain still. What looks like wind is actually a result of motion during vacant. Another common argument is that the absence of the stars in the photographs. People imagine the moon as a place where the sky should be filled with bright stars. So when Apollo images show a background with no stars visible, it can feel, unnatural. But cameras do not work according to intuition. The moon's surface and the astronauts' shoes were brightly by direct sunlight. In order to expose these bright objects properly, the camera settings had to be adjusted in a way that made faint stars disappear from the image. This is not unique to Apollo. The same thing happens in many modern space photographs as well. A dark sky without visible stars is not evidence of a faint set. It is simply how exposure works in photograph. Suspicion also centers on the shadows seen in Apollo photographs. Some critics see the shadows fall at the strange angles and therefore must have been created by multiple studio lights. On a movie set, different lights can create confusing shadow patterns, so this argument sounds persuasive at first. But lunar photographs were taken on an uneven ground with wide-angle lenses and in an environment where light could reflect off the surface. The lander and the given astronauts' bright white shoes. Perspective can also make parallel shadows appear to converge or point in different directions. Just that photograph, a three-dimensional sense can easily be misleading. What appears to be artificial lighting often turns out to be a mix of sunlight, reflected light, and pervasive distortion. Then there is the radiation argument. One of the most technical and most convincing claims for many people. The Earth is surrounded by regions of trapped radiation known as Van Allen belts, and some conspiracists argue that astronauts passing through them will have received fatal doses of radiation. Therefore, they conclude Apollo could never have happened. But that argument leaves out an important detail. The Apollo spacecraft passed through these zones quickly and along trajectories chosen to reduce exposure. The spacecraft's structure also provided some shielding. The total radiation dose received by the astronauts was not negligible, but it was far below a lethal level. The existence of radiation belts is real, but the claim that The main lunar travel impossible is not supported by mission data. Other doubts focus on the moon's environment itself. Some people ask how footprints could remain so clearly defined in dry dust with no moisture. Others asked why there was no geometric blast crater beneath the lunar module, or why the engine plume seemed invisible in some images. These questions often sound persuasive because people are judging the moon by Earth's conditions. But lunar dust is unlike ordinary sand. Its particles are extremely fine, sharp, and unweathered, which allows them to have far more effectively. The lunar module's descent engine had been throttled down significantly during landing, and in the vacuum of the moon, exhaust behaves differently than it does in Earth's atmosphere. As a result, there was no reason to expect a giant crater or a bright Hollywood-style flame beneath the module. Once again, technical realities can do fate to people who are imagining similar conditions from Earth. Perhaps the most famous and cinematic theory of all of it that director Stanley Kubrick helped film the moon landing. This idea grew in popularity because Kubrick had just made 2001, A Space Odyssey, released in 1968, which featured stunning realistic space imagery for its time. To some people, that seemed too convenient. If Hollywood could make space look real, maybe NASA simply hired Kubrick to stage their greatest performance in history. It is an elegant theory, which is exactly why it remains attractive. But there is no credible evidence that Kubrick filmed Apollo footage and many of the so-called, confessions were claims associated with one with that theory have never been shown to the Jews. Hoaxes, mockumentaries misunderstood as fact. That's ridiculous. The theory survives because it feels like perfect story, not because it resides on the spot. Yeah, the biggest weakness of their whole theory may not lie in any angle to the technical claim. It lies in the scale of their alleged deception. If Apollo was fake, then to keep the secret, the Apollo program involved hundreds of thousands of people, including engineers, technicians, contractors, scientists, astronauts, and ministers. The missions were tracked not only by the United States, but also by other countries and independent observers. Most importantly, the Soviet Union, America's main rival in the space race, never exposed Apollo as a fraud during the Cold War, proving that the United States had faked their moon landing would have been one of their greatest propaganda victories imaginable. Yet, the Soviet Union accepted their landing as real. That point alone is difficult to ignore. The evidence also did not end in 1969. Their lunar missions, provided additional confirmation of their Apollo landings. The lunar, reconnaissance orbiter photographed the landing sites where distant stages, tracks, and paths left by astronauts could be seen. Other lunar missions from countries outside the United States also returned images consistent with the Apollo sites. In addition, Apollo mission brought back hundreds of kilograms of lunar rock, which scientists around the world studied and identified as the material from the moon. Those samples have properties that clearly distinguish them from ordinary Earth rocks. There are also, retroreflectors left on the moon by Apollo astronauts, which can still be used in laser ranging experiments from Earth. No single piece of evidence alone ends the debate for true believers, but together they form a body of proof that is That is hard to dismiss. So why does the hoax theory survive? Because in the end, this was never only about photographs or engineering. It also about psychology. Conspiracy theories offer people something emotionally powerful. The feeling that they have seen through the illusion. They transform confusion into a certainty and turn history into a hidden code waiting to be deciphered. The moon landing is especially vulnerable to this because it sits as the intersection of the politics, media, war, science, and myth. It was one of the most watched events in history, and it represented American power at the height of the Cold War. Something so symbolic almost invites suspicion. Time has also made Apollo feel stranger. Younger generations look back and see that the computers of the 1960s were old-fashioned by modern standards. They compare Apollo technology with modern smartphones and find it hard to believe that such machines could guide astronauts to the moon and back. But, you know, this comparison can be misleading. Apollo systems, didn't need to function like modern computer devices. They were built for a very specific purpose, and they operated within a vast industrial and engineering framework. The fact that, older technology looks simple doesn't mean it was incapable. And this is why Artemis 2 matters so much to the modern conversation. Artemis didn't, land on the moon, but it reminded the world that the lunar travel is still extraordinarily difficult. It is expensive, dangerous, and politically fragile. The fact that humanity, has not maintained a constant presence beyond Earth's orbit doesn't prove Apollo was fake. It proves that space exploration is not a straight line of endless progress. It surges forward, then slows, then returns again under difficult, conditions. Apollo was not the start of a permanent lunar civilization. It was a spectacular peak driven by Cold War urgency, innumerous national wealth, and immense resources. When their momentum faded, so did their missions. So why is this moon landing considered a hoax? Because people saw images that they didn't understand. Because distrust of government become deeply rooted in their modern culture. Because technical details are easy to misread when split from their context. Because Hollywood and media made hidden production feel imaginable. And because once the conspiracy, enters their popular culture, it becomes very difficult to kill. But surviving as a theory is not the same thing as surviving as a fact. When you step back and look at the larger picture from Soviet acceptance to lunar rockets, from landing site images to reflectors still on the moon, the whole theory becomes much harder to sustain than the landing itself. However, there are many mysteries surrounding moon landing program, just like the death of NASA personnel, and this has also triggered debate online. And today, I want to talk about this in this video because of the time. In the end, perhaps that is the real mystery, not how human beings reached the moon, but why so many people even now still find it easier to believe that it was all staged than to believe that it truly happened. So what do you think about our story? If you find our story interesting, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe.